Luxury homes were not built to express taste. They were built to solve a financial problem. This claim unsettles the way we are accustomed to reading wealth. We are taught to see grand residences as rewards, symbols of arrival, comfort, and personal preference. From this angle, scale signals indulgence, and permanence suggests confidence. Yet when viewed through the economic conditions that produce them, luxury homes reveal a very different purpose. They were not endpoints of success. They were instruments designed to contain it. The contradiction emerges when we consider what wealth looked like at scale. Small fortunes could be held in cash, placed in banks, or moved through markets with relative ease. Large fortunes could not. The larger the accumulation, the more visible and unstable it became. Cash demanded participation in financial systems that were incomplete, volatile, and often hostile to concentration. Markets were thin. Institutions were fragile. Legal protections were inconsistent. Under these conditions, money did not rest. It required constant defense. This reframes luxury housing as an economic response rather than a lifestyle decision. At the time these homes were built, wealth expanded faster than the infrastructure designed to manage it. Industrialization generated surpluses that overwhelmed banks and distorted markets. Liquidity became exposure. To remain liquid was to remain vulnerable to failure, confiscation, or sudden loss of value. Wealth needed a place to slow down. Luxury homes offered that place. They converted surplus into structure. Land absorbed capital without demanding daily validation. Buildings anchored wealth to geography, law, and social legitimacy rather than financial sentiment. Estates bundled housing, land, labor, and production into systems that could operate internally. What appears extravagant in hindsight was, in practice, a conservative move. These homes were not about display. They were about control. The tension at the center of this model was unavoidable. Wealth required protection, but protection imposed constraint. Cash promised flexibility, but demanded trust in institutions that had not earned it. Fixed assets promised stability, but sacrificed mobility. Luxury homes sat precisely at this intersection. They traded optionality for endurance. They limited choice in order to reduce risk. This helps explain why these homes grew so large. Scale was not about impressing outsiders. It was about absorbing capital efficiently. Small residences did not solve the problem. Only large, integrated properties could take in enough surplus to matter. Size allowed diversification within the estate itself. Different activities offset one another. The home became the visible center of a system designed to keep wealth from overflowing into unstable channels. Modern interpretations often mistake the outcome for the motive. We see ornate architecture and assume indulgence. We see permanence and assume confidence. But permanence was purchased because confidence in financial systems was scarce. Luxury homes were built not because wealth felt secure, but because it did not. They were defensive structures, not celebratory ones. The contradiction sharpens when we recognize what was given up. By embedding money into land and buildings, families accepted rigidity. Capital could not be easily redeployed. Adjustments took time. Exiting the system meant dismantling it. Yet this rigidity was intentional. It imposed discipline. It prevented reactive decisions in moments of panic. In an era defined by frequent shocks, constraint felt safer than freedom. At its core, this story challenges how we interpret wealth itself. Luxury homes were not statements of identity. They were solutions to structural pressure. They existed because money, at scale, had nowhere reliable to go. When financial systems could not carry the weight of accumulated capital, architecture stepped in to do the work. Understanding this changes how we read both luxury and necessity. It's worth pausing here before moving forward. The economic logic behind luxury homes becomes clearer once we abandon modern assumptions about capital mobility. The world that produced these estates did not offer deep, reliable channels for storing and reallocating extreme wealth. Capital accumulated faster than the institutions meant to absorb it. What followed was not extravagance, but improvisation under constraint. Industrial profits arrived unevenly and at unprecedented scale. Railroads, extraction, manufacturing, and finance generated surpluses that dwarfed local banking capacity. Banks were thinly capitalized, loosely regulated, and prone to failure. A single institutional collapse could freeze deposits or erase them entirely. For families whose wealth exceeded the balance sheets of the banks, holding it, diversification across institutions increased exposure rather than reduced it. Each bank represented another potential point of failure. Markets offered little relief. Capital markets were volatile and shallow relative to the size of emerging fortunes. Large positions could not be entered or exited discreetly. Selling assets often signaled distress, triggering the very price. Collapses families sought to avoid. Liquidity existed only under calm conditions. When it was needed most, it evaporated. Cash, in this environment, behaved less like a reserve and more like a risk. Amplifier. Political and legal incentives reinforced this pressure. Concentrated liquid wealth was visible and legible. It could be assessed, taxed, and targeted as governments expanded their fiscal reach. Property and land, by contrast, were embedded in local legal systems and social relationships. They were harder to seize quickly and easier to defend as productive assets rather than speculative holdings. For families concerned with continuity, this distinction mattered. Luxury homes fit naturally into this incentive structure. They provided a legitimate framework for consolidating land, coordinating economic activity, and embedding wealth into forms that appeared socially useful. Estates justified themselves through employment, production, and local stability. They aligned private interest with public tolerance. In doing so, they reduced the political risk attached to extreme accumulation. Financial incentives also favored this approach. Tax regimes often treated landholding more gently than liquid capital. Inheritance laws evolved to protect estates through trusts and long-term arrangements. Over time, wealth held in physical form became quieter. It demanded fewer defensive maneuvers and attracted less scrutiny. The luxury home was not only a container for capital, but a shield against attention. What made this model compelling was not its efficiency, but its predictability. Estates generated steady, if modest, cash flows that were decoupled from national financial cycles. Agriculture, rents, and local commerce responded slowly too. Shocks. This reduced variance mattered more than maximizing return. Stability was the objective. Growth was secondary. Seen this way, luxury homes were rational adaptations to an environment defined by institutional scarcity. They absorbed surplus when markets could not. They slowed capital when speed increased risk. They traded flexibility for durability. The logic was not about preference or taste. It was about minimizing the number of ways wealth could fail. This is the logic that disappears when we project modern financial capacity backward. With today's tools, luxury homes look inefficient. In their own time, they were among the few options available. They solved a problem created by the mismatch between rapid accumulation and fragile systems. This is the part of the story that only makes sense when we focus on incentives rather than appearances. It's worth holding on to this logic before examining how the system actually functioned. Once wealth was embedded into luxury homes and their surrounding estates, it entered a system designed to reduce motion rather than encourage it. Money stopped behaving like a resource seeking opportunity and began behaving like a force maintaining balance. This was not an abstract shift. It was operational. The estate reorganized capital so that stability, not return, became the governing principle. The first mechanism was absorption. Large inflows of surplus were deliberately removed from financial circulation and converted into land, construction, and long-term improvements. These are not cosmetic expenditures. They were financial sinks. Capital that might otherwise pressure banks or distort markets was fixed into assets that could not react quickly to external signals. Illiquidity was not a side effect. It was the point. Inside the estate, money moved slowly and predictably. Revenue did not arrive in volatile bursts tied to distant markets. It accumulated through rents, agricultural output, timber, and local services. These streams were intentionally diverse, not to maximize growth, but to smooth variability. When one activity underperformed, others continued. The system was designed to absorb shocks by spreading them across functions rather than amplifying them through leverage. Expenditures were structured to reinforce internal circulation. Estates employed large workforces whose wages flowed back through housing, food, and services provided on or near the property. This reduced reliance on external suppliers and stabilized costs. Money that entered the system tended to remain within it, circulating through predictable channels. Leakage was minimized not through efficiency, but through proximity. Management replaced speculation as the central financial activity. Stewards and administrators tracked flows over seasons and years rather than days and weeks. Decisions emphasized maintenance, continuity, and balance. Infrastructure was upgraded to last, not to scale. The estate was treated as a living system that needed steady input rather than aggressive optimization. Success was measured by persistence. The luxury home itself functioned as the administrative and symbolic center of this arrangement. It housed records, authority, and coordination. It made the system legible internally while rendering it opaque externally. Wealth no longer needed constant explanation or defense. It was embedded in a structure that justified its own existence through function and continuity. Illiquidity imposed discipline. Because assets could not be easily sold or reallocated, impulsive responses to market noise were curtailed. This constraint protected families from reactive decision-making as much as from external volatility. The system reduced choice at moments when choice was most dangerous. In doing so, it quieted wealth. Risk did not disappear. It changed form. Exposure shifted away from financial markets and toward environmental conditions, labor relations, and political stability. These risks unfolded slowly and locally. They were observable and manageable through administration, rather than timing. For families focused on generational continuity, this trade felt acceptable. The system reproduced itself through inertia, as long as revenues covered costs and social conditions remained supportive, the estate could persist with minimal adjustment. Money stopped asking where it should go next. It had arrived somewhere designed to stand still. This is why luxury homes worked as financial solutions. They transformed restless capital into governed process. They replaced exposure with routine. They did not eliminate uncertainty, but they slowed it to a pace that could be managed. Curiosity is the right response to this machinery. It's worth holding this image of quiet circulation before examining what eventually disrupted it. The system did not collapse because it was misunderstood or mismanaged. It collapsed because the conditions that once justified it disappeared. The luxury home as a financial solution was built for a world in which instability came from the outside. When instability began to come from inside the system itself, the model slowly unraveled. The first source of stress was institutional maturity. Financial systems learned how to carry weight. Banks became better capitalized. Central authorities emerged to prevent cascading failures. Capital markets deepened and widened, allowing large sums to move without immediately distorting prices. New instruments offered diversification and protection without requiring wealth to be frozen in place. Cash, once dangerous, became governable. Compared to these evolving tools, estates began to look unnecessarily rigid. At the same time, the internal economics of large properties weakened. Labor markets changed fundamentally. Industrialization and urbanization created alternatives for workers who had once depended on estates for livelihood. Wages rose. Mobility increased. long-standing social arrangements dissolved. The internal circulation of money slowed as labor became external rather than embedded. Costs rose while productivity stagnated, eroding the balance that had sustained the system. Taxation accelerated this pressure. Modern states required predictable revenue, and land was visible, accessible, and difficult to conceal. Property taxes and inheritance duties transformed illiquidity from protection into liability. Estates needed cash to survive, but their structure resisted generating it quickly. This mismatch forced gradual asset sales, each one weakening the coherence of the system and increasing future vulnerability. Cultural legitimacy eroded as well. Luxury homes had once justified their scale through employment, production, and regional stability. As economies centralized and specialized, that justification weakened. Large estates came to be seen as inefficient repositories of capital rather than productive systems. Public tolerance declined. What had once appeared as stewardship increasingly appeared as stagnation. This shift mattered because the model depended on alignment between private wealth and public acceptance. Most critically, the system lacked adaptability. Luxury homes were designed for continuity, not transformation. When markets globalized, transportation reshaped demand, and financial returns elsewhere accelerated. The estate economy could not respond without dismantling itself. Each adjustment required breaking the internal interdependence that made the system viable. The more integrated the estate, the harder it was to change. The breakdown was therefore slow and uneven. Maintenance was deferred. Portions of land were sold. Revenue streams shrank. The estate often remained outwardly intact while hollowing out internally. Illiquidity, once a shield, became a trap. The very constraint that had protected wealth now prevented its reconfiguration. There was no singular failure, no dramatic collapse. The model ended because its assumptions no longer matched reality. Stability ceased to be scarce. Flexibility became essential. A system built to stand still could not survive in an environment that rewarded constant movement. This was not decline, as moral reckoning, but a structural transition. Wealth did not disappear. It migrated to forms better suited to a faster, more abstract world. The luxury home as financial solution faded quietly, leaving behind architecture that outlived its economic purpose. There's insight here, not nostalgia. Understanding fragility reveals more than celebrating endurance. The modern economy did not render luxury homes irrelevant by changing taste. It rendered them unnecessary by changing capacity. Today's financial systems can do what estates once did: absorb surplus, distribute risk, and protect wealth from sudden loss. The difference is that they do so without requiring money to stand still. Capital can now be diversified, hedged, insured, and repositioned across layers of abstraction that did not exist when large homes served as financial solutions. Modern wealth operates inside architectures rather than buildings. Funds, trusts, holding companies, and legal entities perform the work that land once performed. They create separation between ownership and exposure. They allow wealth to be fragmented without being diminished. Risk is managed through instruments rather than geography. Liquidity, once feared, is now curated. The ability to move capital quickly is treated as protection rather than vulnerability because the systems governing that movement have matured. This shift explains why contemporary luxury homes look different in purpose. They still exist, but they no longer anchor wealth. They do not coordinate production, stabilize labor, or circulate capital internally. They are personal spaces rather than economic centers. The financial logic that once demanded large, integrated estates has migrated elsewhere, leaving architecture to resume a symbolic role rather than a structural one. The deeper implication is that wealth always seeks the least unstable container available. When institutions are weak, wealth becomes physical. When systems are immature, wealth slows itself down. When capacity increases, wealth accelerates again. None of these forms are permanent. They are temporary answers to temporary constraints. Luxury homes were a solution because the problem they addressed was real. When that problem faded, so did the solution. This perspective also reshapes how we interpret visibility. The disappearance of self-sustaining estates does not mean wealth has dispersed. It means it has become less legible. Where land once anchored capital in plain sight, modern systems disperse it across jurisdictions, entities, and instruments that resist easy observation. Power has not diminished. It has become quieter. The lesson is not that the past was wiser or the present more efficient. It is that every wealth structure depends on assumptions that feel permanent until they are not. The luxury home functioned as a financial solution because the world demanded solidity. Modern capital functions because the world can absorb motion. When those conditions change again, wealth will adapt once more. Seen clearly, luxury homes were never mistakes. They were rational responses to a moment when money needed somewhere to stop. Their decline does not invalidate their logic. It confirms it. They existed because the system required them, and they vanished when it no longer did. Understanding this reframes luxury as necessity rather than indulgence. It invites us to see wealth not as a lifestyle choice, but as a series of constrained decisions shaped by the systems that surround it.